My phone buzzed at 6:02 a.m. like a small, precise detonator. The light cut across the ceiling and painted the bedroom in the dead, indifferent blue of a notification. On the lock screen, Preston, VP Strategy. I knew before I answered that it would be thin, that whatever he had to say would come clipped, measured, the way people deliver bad news when they've practiced their pity in front of a mirror. "Dana," he said, voice all corporate calm and someone else's teeth, "we're letting you go. It's been decided. You're difficult to manage. The board is looking to streamline. HR will follow up." No explanation, no 16-step performance review, no attempt to keep me. No "thank you for a decade" in any tone you couldn't tell was reheated. Just the shorthand of a man who'd never had to wrestle with a client in a storm, who thought difficult was a failure rather than a diagnosis. I put the phone down exactly the way I had when the building alarm used to go off at 3 a.m., and I'd walk outside to stand in the rain with a client's spreadsheet that refused to reconcile. I had fixed crises that had been classified as existential. I'd sat in hospital waiting rooms in another time zone while VPs argued over language in a maintenance contract. I'd memorized the birthdays of the CEO's grandchildren because it mattered when you were trying to get a $20 million check signed by someone who forgot anniversaries. The company made a lot of noise about institutional knowledge and legacy relationships. Those phrases had always been code for unpaid emotional labor. For someone like me, it was income, but it was also trust. Years of phone calls, habit, the little rituals that made money move. They told me I was difficult. That's what I texted back. "Your decision," I wrote. "Please send HR and Preston, remember to pass along the client contact lists." He replied with the kind of corporate punctuation that suggests someone folding their hands. "HR will handle everything." 3 sentences. No acknowledgement of crisis or effort. No, "we're sorry." It was easy to be furious in the abstract, less easy to be strategic while your morning coffee was still hot and your calendar still belonged to you. There was a practical thing to consider. For the next few hours, my system access still worked. They were good about instant revocation when they wanted to be cruel. Sometimes revocation came with the same speed as a severance package. Sometimes it lagged. Today, it lagged. A window, unplanned and small, had opened. I counted it in my head like breath counts. 2 hours and 57 minutes. That number fit comfortably in my chest. I could hold it there and move. I do not believe in theatrical revenge. I also do not believe in walking away without a plan. I have a dog named Buster who thinks everything is a personal slight to be investigated. I tied his leash on, brewed coffee that tasted like city grit and the inside of a briefcase, and I walked. As I went, images filed past the sidewalks. Optima's lobby, the green plants that always leaned toward the elevators, where I'd learned to read a room by the way the receptionist's foot tapped. The deals they'd celebrated with cheap champagne and then taken to court in the aftermath. The silence in conference rooms where Preston had clapped himself on the shoulder for a slide deck he didn't write. It occurs to me, even now, that you can fire a person at dawn. You can take their badge, revoke their parking, and hand them a box of their years. But you cannot, in the span of a blinking morning, extract all the human commitment stitched to that person's name. My phone buzzed again. Chloe, a junior analyst who had been with me 3 years fewer than I had, but with a loyalty that felt greedy in retrospect. Her text was terse. "What happened? My inbox is playing catch-up. All client meetings say unassigned. IT is asking for a ticket. Preston called a 9 a.m. status, but calendar shows CEO. Help?" I wrote back with 4 short lines. "Breathe. Update your resume tonight. Take screenshots of everything. I'll call you at 9. I offered more than sympathy, an actual gesture, which to me is the softer, more exact kind of violence. I had to be careful. Collateral damage was real. Chloe had a mortgage and enthusiasm and a student loan that wasn't going to forgive itself because corporate theater required a villain. The 3-hour window is a taut device. You understand the length of it. You can picture the sequence. In those hours, I could do a dozen things, but my moral rubric was tight. There is a particular cruelty in deleting someone else's work or stealing data. That's theft, not strategy. I did not delete. I did not steal. I have never been interested in the dramatics of criminality. A career is more often won by signal than by sabotage. What I had was context, years of client habits, the name of the assistant at Sterling's office that only answered after 1 p.m., the fact that the CEO liked his coffee black with no sugar, and never, under any circumstances, took notes. Context is the difference between a list of emails and the knowledge that a client will call at 8:45 a.m. when their CFO sees a missing line item. I had the names, not the files, the relationships, not the databases. That was enough. Back in my apartment, the city was waking up in stages. Delivery trucks sighed, coffee shops opened their chrome doors. The calendar entries on my phone were still mine. I kept my hands from tremoring. This is not heroism. This is a business decision. Move assets where they will be stewarded rather than abandoned. You can call that revenge if you like. I called it reallocation. If you're asking whether there was a plan before Preston's call, sort of.
If you're asking whether I had rehearsed a response, only insofar as any woman who survives in corporate America rehearses for the possibility of being undervalued. You keep a list of people who would trust you with money. You keep an instinct of where competence will be rewarded. Marcus Thorne had reached out to me in the past year with vague courtship. He was Apex Capital's regional director and a recruitment professional with a soft spot for people who actually delivered. I'd not called him because I wasn't job hunting, but when your badge is soon to be a souvenir, you do what you must. First, I scanned the calendar. Meetings labeled Q3 Review and Northwest Client Sync and Board Prep were clustered between 9 and 11. The owners were mostly junior staff. The calendar read like a map of the company's confidence. People scheduled their faith into rooms. An empty room is not the same as a meeting with no steward. A room without a steward is an invitation for confusion, for nervous boards, for the precise kind of doubt that can inflate into panic. I did a set of small, measured things. I moved some meetings, not in the sense of erasing them, but of creating ambiguity about who would answer for them. I reassigned a couple of internal owners to more senior-sounding titles. I nudged a client-facing meeting out of the CEO's calendar, without, and here is the part that matters, without deleting any note or file. I am not going to explain how to perform these moves. The story's integrity depends on not turning strategy into a hacking manual. It felt in a way like playing a piano piece with subtlety rather than force. You depress a key and the world shifts a little. A client's assistant suspects something is off. A board member's curiosity is piqued by a missing face. There's a cascade that begins as a whisper and then learns to shout. It's astonishing how fragile names on a roster are when the human tether loosens. At 7:15 a.m., with my coffee grown syrupy and my dog curled like a quesadilla at my feet, I called Marcus. He answered on the third ring, which is his small, controlled sign of eagerness. "Dana," he said, "I heard." "You did," I answered. "I'm not out of the game. I'm refocusing." There are negotiations that feel like auctions, and there are ones that feel like conversations between people who have both been hurt by the same kind of bureaucratic cruelty. Marcus offered cash, reasonable, market cursive cash, but not the only thing I wanted. He offered title and autonomy. He promised a role where relationships mattered and where my phone calls would mean something to more than a slide deck. He said the word stewardship like a benediction. If you ever have to walk out of a place you built a scaffolding inside, don't be surprised that the first thing you want is control again. Being difficult at Optima meant you were the person who'd argue until they got the clause right. At Apex, he wanted someone who would argue for clients and not for committee safety. It's astonishing how quickly offers become instruments of identity. I asked for 20% more than the number he'd suggested, and he gave me 15. We settled on an autonomous title and a budget that would actually allow me to hire a competent support staff. I gave him a date for onboarding that fit the moment, immediate, with a 2-week transition clause that protected both of us. A job offer can be a weapon if you sleep it across a room at the right moment. Marcus knew that. He also knew I wasn't looking to stage a public spectacle. The point was to move trust and capital into a place that would steward them, not to burn a building down to make a personal bonfire. Perhaps that makes my story less satisfying for some people. Fine, satisfying is not always responsible. Before I hung up, he said, "If you want, we can touch base with a couple of your clients, quietly. It may catalyze a conversation." There is a small arithmetic of signals in business. A well-timed LinkedIn post, a polite email to a stakeholder, a signal that says something is moving. It's not lying to say I'm excited for next chapter when the next chapter is an act of redistribution. People read momentum when they see it. Investors especially are literal. They convert narrative into allocation the way weather converts pressure into wind. I sat down to draft a message. Tone matters. Enough earnestness to be credible, enough detachment to be dangerous. I wrote and rewrote a single paragraph, and then another, and then I closed the laptop and walked through the list of investors I knew by the shape of their demands rather than the precise figures in their reports. Arthur Sterling sat at the top. He was the whale the whole market pretended not to notice until the water moved. He had an idiosyncratic taste for legacy equity and a contempt for rattled executives. He'd given Optima an $80 million anchor in the last cycle because someone with a better title had assured him the ship would be captained. I did not hit publish on LinkedIn that morning. You do not launch a signal into the market without a plan for the reverberation. Instead, I scheduled it, an old maneuver. Post at 9:05 a.m., just after the first cup of coffee for most executives, before the trading desks warmed up, a moment when attention is scattershot but meaningful. Timing is not magic, it's a probability game. There's a peculiar ethics to moving people's trust. I messaged 2 of my top clients privately, short, factual, and offer of continuity under the umbrella of Apex. I reached out to Chloe again and asked if she could meet for coffee later. She answered with a string of emojis and then something that read like resignation. They just reassigned my deck to Preston's assistant, she said. I'm lost. No, I told her. You're learning what autonomy looks like when people abdicate it.
Update the deck, and if you want, I'll introduce you to someone at Apex. She texted an almost hyperventilating thank you, and then minutes later, a screenshot of a calendar invite that had my name in the owner field. Small relief, small guilt. A reminder that while I engineered the edges of the situation, people like Chloe were living the center. The people who tell you that corporate life is all numbers are the same people who have never had to hold a client on the phone while the CFO of their company dialed in from a parking lot. The truth is relational. Money moves when people trust the hand staying on the tiller. Take away the steward and the money gets nervous. I called HR. I asked them to send the termination package, and quietly to verify whether my non-compete had been executed properly. The woman on the other line sounded like someone who'd been trained to sound soft while refusing to be human. You can't begin at a competitor for 60 days, she said. There are clauses. Was there a signed witnessed copy of that non-compete executed in 2016? I interrupted. Silence on the other end is a thing that changes brightness. It looks like I don't have a wet signed copy in the file, she said, voice folding into something like confusion. There's a scanned version, but I don't see a signature. There it was. Not a miracle, not a judicial decree. An HR file with a missing line. A clerical error, a window through a wall. Legal outcomes are not binary, they are a stack of possibilities. A missing signature does not nullify litigation risk, but it does complicate it in a way that changes investors' appetites. For them, a legal smoke is a different smell than a conflagration. Investors panic when multiple smells suggest the building may burn. I did not rub my hands together. This was not a fantasy of invulnerability. It was an exploitable fact. It meant I could accept Apex's offer without immediately being muzzled by the company I just exited. It meant a timeline for migration that was workable. There is a cruel thing about being good at what you do. You notice the people who benefited from your labor, and you also notice those who pretended not to notice. Optima had a veneer of competency. Behind it, decisions were being made in boardrooms where loyalty was traded like chips at a casino. Preston had been promoted because he was the CEO's son, because incompetence is often rewarded by blood rather than merit. Richard Vance, the CEO, called himself a visionary in town hall meetings, while outsourcing the messy, honest work of managing relationships to me and people like me. That is the picture of meritocracy they like to sell, a funnel from talent to recognition. In reality, the funnel is a sieve. The morning's choreography demanded a public signal sooner or later. You cannot quietly move capital in the modern world without someone noticing.
I scheduled the LinkedIn post because I wanted to control the narrative rather than let rumor do it. Rumor is a blunt instrument, and investors hate blunt instruments. A little before 9, a number I recognized as the assistant at Arthur Sterling's office appeared on my screen. I nearly didn't answer. I thought for a moment of letting the scheduled post do its work, of seeing whether the market would flutter on its own. I am not by nature inclined to self-annihilation, but then I reminded myself of 2 things. 1, people like Sterling respond to relationship, not to algorithms. 2, when you ask for money, you ask in person. You do not send a hostage note and expect the banker to deliver. Ms. Vance, the assistant said, and misnamed me because in Optima, people assumed my last name was the company I served. It was an occupational hazard. No, I corrected smoothly. Dana Morelli. There was a pause, full of scheduling. Mr. Sterling has a lunch at the Four Seasons at noon today. Are you available at 1? The assistant was giving me a slot that would have been impossible if I'd waited for the post to stir the waters. The window for influence had turned, potentially, into a hallway where a single door sat open. I told her I could do 1. I booked the reservation, felt the small, improbable click in my chest that comes with the opening of a possible future.
When I hung up, the city outside had the luminous, indifferent quality of a contact lens. I thought of Richard Vance's face, the way he smoothed his tie like a man polishing a public image, the way he took credit for long meetings he'd slept through. I thought of Preston's textless tone. I thought of Chloe's 3 words and a punctuation mark. I thought of the missing signature in HR's file like a crooked tooth that could be pulled. By 9:05, I hit publish. The post was economy of tone, gratitude stitched to ambiguity. After a decade of learning and growth, I wrote, I'm excited for a new chapter. To those who've trusted me, I remain committed to stewardship. To the next stage, I'm ready. Not a burn, not a boast. The punctuation was intentional. There's an art to leaving energy in a sentence, so others will spend it for you. Notifications began to behave like weather. A small LinkedIn applause, a DM from a client offering support, an ex-colleague with 3 words, called Sterling, a reporter asking for a comment. The market doesn't move on virtue, it moves on expectation. And expectation is a contagious thing. My inbox populated with more private notes than public applause. Anonymized messages from people at Optima asking if I could talk to them about internal processes. That one hurt. You don't want to be thanked only after you're gone. But gratitude in private is still gratitude. It's currency. The 3-hour window was now a visible line on the calendar. The clock did not care about moral nuance. It only ticked. I used the minutes to tidy the edges of my plan. A quiet email to Arthur's office confirming location. A note to Marcus to say I might need him at short notice for onboarding logistics. A message to Chloe reminding her of the coffee. And somewhere in the city, Optimus systems were waking to the fact that a hand had been removed from the steering wheel. The assistant at Sterling's office, too early to be a signal, too late to be an accident, did her work. Small frictions began to show in tiny discrepancies. A calendar event with an ambiguous owner, a client call routed to reception, a junior analyst forwarded a board question, and the board question bounced because the steward to answer it was, in a defensive move, suddenly absent. I did not create the chaos. I merely nudged the axes of attention. At 11:47 a.m., as I stood at a corner waiting for the light to change, a stock ticker scrolled a small red number by Optimus symbol, an almost imperceptible tick that could be read as a blip or a warning. My phone buzzed again. Preston had sent a group message to the exec team, furious and clipped, asking whether anyone could cover his calendar while he handled the personnel situation. His tone was the shrill of someone surprised that a life raft had a hole. Chloe tested. I'm in a meeting with finance. They asked why client X wasn't looped. I said I didn't know. Now they're asking HR for records. There was fear in the message that felt bigger than the punctuation. It felt human. I felt my chest clench in a way that was less about victory and more about responsibility. I had pulled a thread and watched a sweater loosen its weave. Some people would get chilly as a result. Responsibility, in my view, means not disappearing into triumph. I took a small, private step. I sent Chloe a message with a time and a list of people who would call her with references. I will back you, I wrote. I will do it publicly if you want. If you want privacy, I will do it privately. Don't be embarrassed. Her reply was immediate and worm-like with gratitude. You are the reason I lasted this long, she said. If I allowed myself a human failure, it was that I had let myself expect this to be less costly for the people I cared about. I went to the lunch with Sterling, because deals are conversations, and in the business of relationships, lunch is a kind of confession. There is always a moment when the room's air condenses and reveals what people value. The Four Seasons smells like lemon and an effort at dignity. The kind of place where the servers understand your nervousness is a commodity and a service. He arrived with his assistant trailing, with the easy, pale smile of a man who has never harvested indignity. He called me by name, too formal, and then relaxed into the fact of the meeting. Dana, he said, your post caught my eye. My timing rarely matches your schedule, I said. I thought we could talk about stewardship.
We talked like people who had misgivings about each other's motives, but a shared interest in making sure money was tended to by a hand that knew the soil. He was direct, less sentimental than the press would lead you to believe. Why leave Optima? He asked. Because they decided stewarding relationships was less important than optics, I said. They'll need trustees who can manage through trust gaps. I can do that. I'm offering you continuity, not chaos. He liked the specificity. Investors are, at their core, allergic to fog. They want to convert confidence into allocations that make sense on paper and in the nervous rooms where they sleep. He asked for details, none of which I offered in the form of stolen files or whisper campaigns. He wanted a sense of what would ensure continuity. I told him about people, not databases. The assistant who would answer at 8:45. The finance director who always warned a quarter in advance when a line item would wobble. The way an old CFO we call at night when a number felt off. He listened like a man calculating a migration path for an estate that might be better tended elsewhere. We arranged a tentative move, an allocation question, not a signed instrument. It was enough. It was never about the moment of signature. It was about the moment of decision. Investors do not hand over capital on charisma alone. They hand it over when someone offers them a plausible human map out of confusion and into competence. When he rose to leave, he thanked me with a small formality, and then, almost as an afterthought, said, "You understand the ripple effect." "Yes," I said. The word felt like an admission. On my way out, my phone buzzed. The ticker near my table had moved, a slightly deeper red. News outlets picked up the LinkedIn note and spun it into a narrative with the predictable sweet tooth of sensationalism. "Optima executive exits," one headline read. "Leadership questions at Optima," said another. The market doesn't require truth. It requires stories that can be translated into behavior. Driving back to the city in the kind of taxi that smells faintly of disinfectant and solitude, I stayed off social media for a while. You do not want to watch your own plan like a man at the edge of a cliff listening for an avalanche. You need to hold the rope steady. At 3:02 p.m., the board at Optima scheduled an emergency meeting. Preston's text to the execs had been forwarded. HR compiled a terse FAQ about roles and responsibilities. The legal counsel, Gerald, messaged me a perfunctory, "We received notice you posted publicly," as if the substantive floor of the world were merely hospitality. I read his message and thought about the missing signature in the HR file. Legal is not magic. Legal is a machine of delays and paperwork and cautious posture. A lawyer can write a letter that makes your life interesting, but they cannot always make investors stubborn.
Marcus called to say that a few clients had already sent tentative notes expressing concern and interest in speaking with us. "It's moving," he said. "Quietly for now, but it's moving." His voice had the strange tone of someone delighted by the river's current when he could control the bridge. There is a moment in every strategy when you realize your actions have an ethical temperature. Cold strategies win, but leave frost behind. Warm strategies may preserve relationships at the cost of clarity. I had tried to do both, reallocate trust where it would be stewarded, and cushion the people who would find themselves exposed. I had failed to be perfect. Chloe's mourning had been a kind of collateral. The board had noticed a gap and moved to patch it without smoothing the underlying rupture. At 5:30, I sat at my desk in the small suite Marcus had arranged for me to use before my official start date. It smelled like new coffee and the paperbacks of a place trying to convince you it was a good bed. My inbox showed a thread from Arthur's assistant confirming a transfer meeting. A small bureaucratic inevitability hummed in the background. There was also a terse email from Gerald, the Optima counsel, which read less like law and more like a polite threat. "We've noted your social posts and outreach," he wrote. "Please consider this communication a notice that Optima will review any further actions with counsel." The letter had the flavor of a man choosing words that would scare interns more than investors. It was important. Threats had teeth. But threats can be blunt instruments when the underlying facts are messy. The missing signature in HR's file was not something Gerald could fix with a stern paragraph. I closed the laptop and stood up, feeling an odd hollowing that had nothing to do with triumph. There was an ache that is not remorse, so much as recognition that you had cut a tether someone else relied upon. If there is a moral arithmetic to revenge, it is that numbers rarely reflect the cost borne by the small people who inhabit large institutions. Chloe would have to fix decks. The assistant who took messages would have to answer harder questions. That cost sits in the bones. I picked up Buster and walked him through the park. Children were kicking stones. The city held that normal, stubborn economy of life. People who had nothing to do with Optima continued to live in their own moral geographies. This is always the case. Big things happen, life continues to press against the edges. Back home, before the sky quit light entirely, I sat down and drafted a note, not for publication, not for investors, but for myself. It was a small list of principles. Don't break things you can fix. Do not punish people for managerial incompetence. When possible, build bridges for those who will be displaced. I underlined the last item twice. There is only so much you can do when systems fail.
You can use your competence to put people into better places if you have the means. The phone buzzed with one last message before I turned it off for the night. Preston had texted the execs a personal apology to the board. Richard Vance's calendar showed 3 emergency calls scheduled for the next morning. A rumor ticker said there might be an earnings call earlier than scheduled. I slept like a person who had wound themselves into a rope and then tightened the knot. The night was thick and dreamed of lists. When I woke the next morning, I received a message from Gerald, Optima's counsel. He wanted to ensure I understood that any outreach to investors could constitute grounds for legal action. His note read like a man clearing his throat. I replied in 3 sentences. I am within my rights to speak with people I've worked with for a decade. I will not publish confidential data. I intend to be responsible. I did not tell him that the non-compete file in HR appeared to lack a signature, and that his threats, though polite, were less invulnerable than he probably assumed. The market is a sensitive animal. It senses discomfort and ambush the way dogs sense thunder. By noon, a clearer narrative had taken shape. An esteemed client relations lead departed. An investor meeting was scheduled. The CEO's calendar looked confused. Optima's stock price moved in the way that was consistent with rumor and panic more than with facts. There is a grotesque economy to this. The more chaos looks like incompetence, the more capital flows away from the thing that looks fragile. At 12:32 p.m., Arthur Sterling's assistant called to confirm lunch. Her tone was crisp, appreciative of someone who respects time. Mr. Sterling will be ready to discuss allocation, she said. He asked for an outline of what continuity might look like. I answered plainly. I'll bring an outline, I said. Not of documents, but of people and processes. She paused, perhaps realizing how odd that sounded. Then she said, We prefer that. When the line went dead, the city felt like a place with doors closing and opening at the same time. The pivot point was near. The narratives we tell one another about competence and leadership had begun to rearrange themselves around small facts: a missing signature, a scheduled lunch, a polite LinkedIn post. People would later write case studies about points where institutions unravel. They'd look for a single, sharp culprit. The truth would be messier. It would be human. As I walked into the Four Seasons and slid into the seat across from a man who could conceivably move $80 million with a sentence and a color-bounded spreadsheet, I felt the weight of the 3-hour window recede like a tide. I had used a moment that was given to me by the sloppiness of people who underestimated the worth of stewardship. I had not stolen files. I had not deleted records. I had used relationships as my currency.
And somewhere deep in my chest, in the place where moral clarity should live, I felt a thorn. Victory without gentleness is hollow. Redistribution without compassion bruises. I knew this as well as I knew how to read an investor's body language. This would not be clean. It would not be absolute. The lunch began with small talk, an awkward barometer of sincerity, and then steered into the practical. I laid out the map I had promised, named assistants, CFOs who would react in predictable ways, and a plan for continuity that relied on people rather than spreadsheets. He listened like someone cataloging dominoes. If you move, he said quietly, and if you convince me, Optima will have to account for a loss of confidence. That can be the end of careers. I understand, I said. It can also be the beginning of something better, he added. By the time I left the restaurant, the world had narrowed to a line of possibilities. The board at Optima would awaken tomorrow with a list of holes they had to account for. Preston would look to a crisis script and find it insufficient. Richard would have to answer questions he had been told earlier he would never have to answer. People like Chloe would need help they might not have expected to ask for. Investors would react in the precise animal way they always do, quickly and without grace. I walked back to my temporary office and opened my inbox. There was a message from a reporter, another from an internal Optima manager asking for clarification, and a terse, long email from Marcus, now bracing for the number of clients he would need to shepherd into a new relationship. Be ready, he wrote. You may not like what happens next. I did not like the idea of watching a company I had served for years floundered by the removal of context. I did not like the way people's lives might be disrupted. But I also knew that keeping quiet in the face of nepotism and incompetent leadership is complicity. You cannot be the person who enabled mediocrity and then be surprised when the house leans. Even as the first fractures formed, The work that remains is not violent. It is human and tedious. Comfort a junior who has lost a boss. Coach a client through the transfer of trust. Introduce people to new stewards who will keep the lights from flickering. The big moves make the headlines. The small moves keep bread on tables. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Arthur's assistant confirming an earlier time. The thing I had built in the morning had purchased me another day to act. The dominoes were set. The market is unsentimental. It recognizes competence and knives at the hands that result in fear. It also punishes cruelty. I sat in my chair and took a breath. The story had not concluded. It would, very soon, become public in ways I could not entirely control. That is the price of playing with the levers of capital. You must be willing to live with the ways the world reacts to the truth you present.
I stood up, poured another cup of coffee, and wrote Chloe a note with the head of the group's HR at Apex CC'd quietly, just so she would have a line. Small acts. Necessary atonements. Outside the window, Optimus headquarters loomed like a theater set. You could not tell from the glass whether the people within were competent or frightened. Sometimes those two things look the same. I dialed Marcus and told him to prepare for a rapid onboarding. He laughed, which is its own kind of readiness. "Are you okay?" he asked. "As okay as I am," I said. "We'll see what the board does tomorrow." He said nothing for a beat. Then he said, "If he crumbles, be careful. Power gets ugly when it slips." Power getting ugly is a thing you expect. The ugliness that follows is usually predictable. Press cycles, investor letters, legal threats. None of that was drama enough to frighten me. What made my chest tighten was the knowledge that people I liked might be hurt. That is the cost of moving a system that was poorly tended. I checked my watch. It was 5 minutes to the hour when the first public question would be asked on the wires. The LinkedIn post had done its work. Attention had been seeded. The market would react, as markets always do, to perception as much as reality. For now, the window had closed. The next stage was bigger and noisier. I turned my phone over on the desk and let the silence of the face-down device be a small, private liturgy. There would be calls. There would be bluster from legal. There would be the small, resistible cruelty of the prominent trying to preserve their image. There would also be the quiet work of building new structures that could carry what had been abandoned. I had been called difficult at dawn. At dusk, I had walked into a restaurant with the possibility of shifting $80 million in a single conversation. The title of the day was not about vengeance so much as reallocation. Moving capital to competence. Moving people to places that would value them properly. The moral arithmetic would be debated in many rooms. My part was human, methodical, and, if I am honest, deeply imperfect. And then my phone buzzed again. This time, a name I'd been waiting for. Arthur Sterling's in-house counsel, with a proposed agenda for the meeting and an aside that read, "We should speak before the markets open tomorrow." It felt like the point of no return, which is different from the point of no consequences. I put the phone down and looked out at the city. Lights winked. Somewhere, a board was unscrewing the narrative they had been feeding themselves. Somewhere else, a junior analyst was under a bright lamp revising a deck and wondering what tomorrow would bring. I walked out of the office and into the street, letting the city swallow any last smallness I carried. The rest of the moves would be done in larger rooms, with more voices and with legal men waving formal notes. My hand had simply pointed where competence should sit.
Whether the people who sat in the resulting silence would use that competence well was another question, and the only honest answer I had was that I would try to make the cost bearable for those who had not chosen to be collateral. The first act had been delivered. The next one would be louder. If the first act was a nudge, the second was a shove. The morning after the lunch with Arthur Sterling, the city felt different, less like background and more like a jury leaning forward. Before my coffee had cooled, my phone was a metronome of small alarms. Marcus with an update, Chloe checking in, an analyst at Optima asking for clarification about a deck she'd been reassigned. The world had noticed a hole and was beginning to peer through it. Quick aside, if you like stories where the little details change everything, subscribe. I promise enough petty human things to keep you invested. I step into the day knowing there will be noise. Gerald's polite letter sits in my inbox like an unopened box of diplomatic ordnance. Formal, measured, threatening in the way someone threatening to call a lawyer usually is. Loud enough to intimidate, vague enough to buy time. I forward it to Marcus and to Sarah, Apex's general counsel, with one line, "We'll respond, we'll be careful." Sarah replies almost instantly with the kind of clarity that is its own kind of comfort.
Don't post, don't promise documents. We argue posture, not posture's theatrics. She's practical and understands how quickly PR and litigation become a single beast that bites whoever is nearest. At Optima, things start to unravel precisely in the places you'd expect. Meetings with missing owners, junior people left to field questions they weren't hired to answer. Preston's panic text, less composed now, all caps, a string of managerial adjectives, makes the rounds. The board schedules an emergency briefing. Richard Vance cancels lunch and schedules a 1 p.m. Q3 earnings call for 3 p.m. The calendar reads like a countdown. Arthur does what Arthur does. He calls the board. He doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. He leaves a few voicemails with the kind of quiet that makes people tidy their affairs. He speaks to a stewardship gap and then to a numerical reality. Liquidity begets attention. When he shifts his allocation, or signals he will, other investors feel the balance go slack in their hands. It's not immediacy as a single signature. It's a psychological cascade. You will never convince someone that 8 figures are safe if a trusted voice suggests the competent hands have left the helm. By noon, the wires have a dozen versions of the same story. Optima executive exits prompt governance questions. The phrasing is careful because reporters know that tentative language sells better than a definitive accusation. But the gist is there. Someone who stewarded relationships left publicly. People who read such things do 2 things. They call counsel and they glance at their portfolios.
My phone pings with a message from Arthur's assistant confirming that the preliminary conversation we had is moving toward a formal allocation meeting with his team. We'll prepare a memo, she writes. If you can deliver names and continuity plans, that will be helpful. My fingers hover. I draft a short factual list. No files, no confidential attachments. Just names and processes. Human networks, not data dumps. Across town, Optima's legal counsel, Gerald, sends another note, this one with the faint scent of impatience. Ms. Morelli, he writes, we must insist you cease and desist from further outreach to Optima's investors. There's a line about damages and fiduciary duty and a signature block that smells like someone scoring points on a lawyerly scoreboard. I reply with a short, factual email. I will not publish confidential files. I will communicate with people I've personally stewarded for a decade. I will cooperate with any reasonable process. I do not offer contrition because there is none to give. I do offer responsibility because there is. Responsibility is a valet who wants a tip. It demands being present to the people harmed, and so I call Chloe. She answers on the second ring, her voice small and tired. They pulled my deck into a finance review, she says. They asked me things I didn't know. I froze. You didn't freeze, I say. You were confused. Confusion is forgivable. I'll make calls. Marcus wants to meet you. Apex can use someone with your instincts. She repeats the name like it's a lifeline, and then sobs, briefly, as if that would fix a deck. I feel a twist in my chest and offer instead the only practical things. References, a quiet email to hiring, a call with Marcus to explain her strengths. It isn't enough to erase the day, but it is a kindness that eats at the guilt. At 3 p.m., the earnings call begins. I am watching from a suite set up by Marcus, surrounded by a small team prepping for whatever client movement might come through. The TV in the corner shows Optima's logo and the city skyline behind their glass boardroom. Inside Optima, Richard Vance adjusts his tie like a man preparing for a test he hasn't studied for. He speaks with the practiced cadence of someone who has scheduled confidence as a daily habit. The CFO does their best to keep numbers tidy. Then, as the company fields questions, an investor asks the question everyone is thinking but no one had voiced. Who is currently responsible for active stewardship of client X? We were told someone would take point. The calendar shows a gap. The question is clinical, not cruel. It is the polite voice of capital asking to be reassured. There is a texture to silence on a call. It is not complete nothing. It is the tense that precedes the fall. Richard stammers. The junior director joins in on a clarifying note that only highlights the gap. Preston, who is supposed to be prepared for optics, sends a message that reads like a man learning leadership from a script. The board's face in the glass looks like someone watching a slow public unravel. 2 things happen with the speed of weather. First, an analyst on the call interprets the stewardship gap as signal risk, not a mere scheduling error. Second, an algorithm somewhere that watches for sentiment and triggers sell orders sees the pattern. Board instability plus investor concern plus public resignation equals risk. A few automated trades occur, then more. Optimus ticker turns yellow, then orange, then a small, sharp red. I listen with a stomach that no longer feels like my own. Marcus stands behind me, quiet. He texts, "If Sterling signals, others will follow." I read the live transcript as the call dissolves into defensive talking points. "We are addressing operational issues," Richard says, voice thin. The board issues a brief statement about leadership commitment. It reads like a Hail Mary. By late afternoon, Arthur's team confirms a decision to shift a significant portion of their allocation toward a set of opportunities where stewardship is better documented. He's not dramatic, he's measured. His decision is a model of investor psychology. Move away from the smell of sloppiness before it becomes a fire. Once the movement starts, a few other investors, less public, more reactive, adjust their positions. The market is a social creature. It smells fear like a grade schooler smells a lie. Preston's texts become more frantic. Richard calls an emergency board meeting and begins the sort of finger-pointing that looks like a person trying to learn loyalty by trial and error. The board convenes, and within 24 hours a decision is made. An interim committee is appointed to review leadership and governance. The phrasing is a polite way of saying that someone who once seemed invulnerable has a match held to his sleeve. The press is gruesomely efficient. Headlines sharpen from concern to crisis in under a day. Pundits who once praised Optimus' vision now measure its grounding. The optics matter more than the nuance. People who profit from narrative make fortunes on the cascade. Legal posturing becomes louder. Gerald's counsel letters are combed through by several law firms. Optima threatens action. I receive a cease and desist that is heavier in tone, invoking non-compete clauses and potential damages. It's performative, intended to intimidate and to create a cost of continuing the outreach, but the substance remains complicated by a basic clerical failure, the missing wet signature in HR's file from 2016. Gerald can litigate, he can issue subpoenas and threaten injunctions, and he does. Litigation timelines are long and messy beasts. They can draw blood and time, but they do not necessarily move investors faster than the smell of leadership incompetence. Sarah, Abrex's counsel, advises a posture of careful confidence.
We do nothing reckless. We do not publish confidential material. We document everything. There will be motions and letters, and perhaps even a demand for arbitration, but the strategic fact is the same. Investors respond faster than courts. Courts require evidence. Evidence accrues slowly. Investors move instantly. And then there is the human collateral. Chloe is offered a short-term contract at Apex to assist with client migrations. She accepts, visibly relieved, and the relief makes the edges of what I did softer and more complicated at once. Her mother calls me and thanks me with a grace that makes me realize my victory was also someone's lightness. I introduce Chloe to two people in Marcus's team. They chat about mentorship and skill sets. These are not cures for structural harm, but they are small acts that attempt to redistribute care where it was pulled. A week in, the board meets publicly and announces Richard's resignation. The statement is a dense, formal apology for disruption and a promise of a governance review. Preston is placed on leave. The optics of nepotism are aired, and no one at the table is comfortable. The fallout is immediate. Senior hires leave quietly, public confidence wanes, and Optima begins to resemble a ship gathering holes faster than it can be patched. I am not immune to watching people I once collaborated with be wrecked by events. There is an ache to seeing names on a list that once meant daily collaboration, now mean headlines. I think of the receptionist who always had the one perfect pen for signatures. I think of the assistant at Arthur's office who scheduled that one improbable slot that morning. People are not statistics. They are soft things that sometimes have to be protected. There are calls from reporters, board members, and former colleagues. Some ask accusatory questions. Others ask for counsel. I answer plainly. I acted within my rights. I did not steal data. I did not publish confidential information. I offered stewardship to clients in a lawful way. I am careful with words, because words in these moments are both sword and shield. Meanwhile, Marcus and I shepherd clients who are willing to move. Some do, some do not. The clients who do move are not votes of vengeance. They are votes for the competence they have known for years. It's not that they're disloyal. It's that loyalty is a two-way street, and when the road is no longer maintained by those in charge, people take the bridge that looks safest. A day arrives when Optimus stock shows a sustained drop. Trading desks treat it as a function of risk rather than a moral statement. Analysts publish notes revising ratings. The market punishes the perception of governance gaps even when the underlying assets are sound. That is the cruelty of capital. It prioritizes immediate risk mitigation over long-term construction. Preston calls me once. He's short, panicked, and oddly human in his fear. "Dana," he says, "this isn't what we expected."
"No," I answer. "It rarely is." He asks if I could, softly, almost like someone asking for forgiveness, come back and help explain things to the board. The absurdity of the request is part of the theater. The company believed it could discard the people who made it work and then borrow them back when the noise got loud.
I decline. Not because I'm heartless, but because the dynamic that produced the problem is the one we were correcting by moving trust where it would be stewarded. Returning to Optima would be a temporary balm at best, and a complicity in a system that rewarded the wrong things at worst. There are consequences. Some employees who were close to day-to-day operations at Optima find themselves in precarious positions. I make a choice. I instruct Marcus to consider offering short-term consulting contracts to a few displaced mid-level managers who would otherwise struggle. We do not save everyone. We cannot. Systems run at scale and people live in smaller rooms. But we can try to make the pivot less brutal for those we can reach. Marcus balks at the PR risk. Bringing people with Optimatize onto our bandwagon looks self-serving if not handled with care, but I insist. There is a simple human decency in giving people a bridge. Meanwhile, the legal world buzzes like a hive. Counsel letters multiply, and the word litigation hums in the air like a distant insect. Optima's counsel threatens to sue for tortious interference and breach of fiduciary duty. I forward the letters to Sarah, and we assemble a team of external counsel to prepare a defense. The missing signature in HR's file becomes an unglamorous hero of the story, not because clerical error is lovely, but because it complicates the company's ability to claim I violated a valid non-compete. That technicality matters in corporate law the way a seam matters in tailoring. It changes how the fabric holds. I do not take pleasure in the legal scrimmage. It is costly, and I know courts do not move at the speed of markets. My satisfaction is muted and practical. The record shows I did not misappropriate documents. I did not defraud. I communicated with people I had stewarded. The line I walked was tight and deliberate. The world rewarded my holding of it. There is a moment 2 weeks into the flap when a reporter asks me whether I consider myself vindictive. The camera wants a one-liner, the public wants a villain. I answer with the truth. I wanted stewardship restored. I wanted competence to be treated like the asset it is. The interviewer persists. What about the people hurt in the process? I take a breath. Collateral damage matters to me. I say their names, Chloe, the receptionist, a junior account manager who had been my first hire, and mean it. Names are a kind of confession. They anchor you to the fact that corporate moves have human consequences. At Apex, my new role begins in earnest.
There is a natural glee in being given resources and autonomy after a decade of quid pro quo labor. Marcus gives me a suite with a better view than my last office. He hires a small team that includes people I respect. We build processes that prioritize human context, introducing named stewards for key accounts, writing down not just contracts, but the little habits that keep clients steady, a weekly call with a named assistant, a shared document that contains nothing legal, but everything relational, like who calls for what on bad days. It is practical, not romantic. There is a kind of joy in creating structures that honor what I've learned. Relationships, not data, move capital best when tended. But the victory is quieter than I thought it would be. Opening a new office feels like making a ship that can weather a storm, but the harbor we leave behind still has people who will face the aftermath. I take that seriously. Once, at the end of a long day, I walk into the small bullpen Marcus set aside, and a young account manager, someone who had transferred quietly from Optima with a parachute we arranged, asks me if I felt bad. The question is blunt, childlike in its morality. Do you regret what you did? I consider the honest answer. I regret the things that hurt people who did not choose to be in the middle of this. I don't regret refusing to be treated as disposable. The manager nods, as if that were an acceptable calculus. Moral clarity, for me, has always been a spectrum. In the middle weeks, Optima stumbles enough that the board installs an interim CEO. There are careful press releases about strategic renewal. They hire consultants and hold town halls about transparency and governance. Change in corporations looks like meetings and PowerPoints and the slow accretion of policies. It does not, unfortunately, always align with people's calendars or bills. The company will, in time, recover something of its position. Capitalism has an elasticity to it. But the reputational damage reshapes leadership decisions. The people who benefited most from the old culture, nepotism's beneficiaries, are thinner on the ground. There's a legal skirmish that hits a crescendo 3 months later. Optima files a motion alleging tortious interference and breaches of covenant. We respond. Depositions happen in windowless rooms with small bottles of water and bigger egos. Legal teams exchange documents that are heavy on privilege claims and light on moral clarity. Both sides know that a protracted trial is expensive and eats reputations. For Optima, the calculus is about deterrence as much as remedy. For us, it's defense and the preservation of clients. In the end, there is an agreement that looks like a compromise. No confidential documents exchanged,
a limited settlement that avoids an injunction, and, critically, a public statement acknowledging a governance review and commitment to improve transition processes.
The non-compete's missing signature never becomes the headline in court. It simply reframes the pressure points and makes a heavy-handed injunction unlikely. When the dust settles, I could, if I wanted, tell a simpler story. I was wronged, I retaliated, justice was served. But the truth is less tidy. I watch young associates I care about rebuild careers. I offer recommendations, networks, and a few short-term contracts. I lobby within Apex to create a modest fund to help people displaced by the Optima fallout pay for resume coaching and emergency expenses. Marcus agrees. It's not a cure for structural failure, but it is a concrete attempt to pay some debt. People ask me if I would do it again. I think of the receptionist and of Chloe's exhausted voice. I think of the assistant whose careful scheduling gave me a chance. I think of Gerald's letters and Sarah's steadiness. I think about the quiet dinners I used to have with clients when the work was hard and gratitude was real. I do it differently, I tell them. I would try to make the cost more bearable for people who were swept up in it. That answer is both shame and lesson. There are small private moments that feel like absolution. Chloe, 3 months after joining Apex, sends me a voice note. She's leading a client review and says she feels steadier. Her voice is sharper. "You gave me a bridge," she says. "I'm trying to walk across it without falling." I cry, briefly, and then I get back to work with the kind of pragmatic resolve that looks like coffee. 6 months after being fired at dawn, I sit in my office at Apex on a late autumn afternoon. The city outside is a slow throb of light. My team is a mix of people who have been burned and people who are always ours. We've set up structures that make stewardship explicit, named custodians for accounts, a system that flags relationship risk earlier than spreadsheets do, and a culture that values the person who remembers birthdays as part of risk mitigation. It's less glamorous than a headline, but it is what keeps business running. I pick up my phone and scroll through messages. Gerald's last note was a terse acknowledgement that settlement terms were in play and litigation was being deferred. Preston's last message to me is an apology that reads like someone learning accountability late. He's quieter now. The arrogance has a bruise. Richard's new role is undefined. He writes a short op-ed about reflection and leadership that reads like a man practicing humility for the press. People do strange things after public falls. Some learn, some pivot, some do neither. I live with a small, steady ache. It's the awareness that competence is a fragile thing when systems are rewarded for optics rather than outcomes. If there is a moral lesson, it's not that retribution is noble, it's that reallocation of trust matters. Systems that pretend people are interchangeable will always be brittle.
That brittleness is not discovered by virtue. It's discovered by omissions, unsigned documents, absent stewards, promoted relatives. You can mock the theatrics, but when the theater collapses, people fall. A year in, Apex thrives in ways that matter to me. Our clients report higher satisfaction, our churn is down, our team is steadier. Marcus jokes that all we need now is a plaque and a nice building. I laugh, which is a small victory in itself. The legal clouds have thinned, Optima has new leadership, and in time will find its rhythm. Whether it will be better is up to the people left steering it. Sometimes at night, I think about the morning phone buzz at 6:02 a.m. and how that tiny detonator set something larger in motion. I do not romanticize the end. There were consequences for people I like. I wish it could have been otherwise. But there is also a trial in which competence finally got its due. That is not the same as revenge. Revenge wants to ruin. Stewardship wants to repair. What I did was move trust to a place where it would be acted upon, not merely spoken about. If there's a final private truth to my morning at dawn, being called difficult was less an indictment than a mislabel. I was difficult because I refused to accept lazy answers for complex problems. I was difficult because I argued until clauses were right. In the end, those habits were not vices. They were undervalued skills. They were the scaffolding that others treated as invisible until the scaffolding was gone. On a small concrete terrace behind the Apex office, I sometimes eat lunch and watch the city perform its relentless, indifferent life. A kid chases a pigeon. A woman in a suit laughs too loudly on a phone call. The world does not pause because high finance rearranges itself. People make lives inside these tectonic shifts. That fact keeps me humble. There's a kind of pettiness that is cheap, and a kind of strategic clarity that costs you sleep. I earn sleep by being ruthlessly practical and epically messy, which is to say, fully human. If the moral ledger is to balance, it will have penciled-in corrections and line items like helped Chloe, called HR, and funded emergency consulting. It will also have numbers that mean I can now build a place that values stewardship as a real corporate competency. In the quiet after the storm, I find that what I wanted most was not revenge but recognition, that the invisible labor of keeping companies honest is work and deserves compensation and respect. When that recognition comes from a different place, a competitor who actually values the craft, you learn that institutions are less important than the people who make them run. I still answer my phone at odd hours. I still remember birthdays. I keep lists of who calls at 8:45 a.m. because those details are the currency of trust. If you can take one thing from this, let it be this. Systems crumble not because of malice, but because they forget how to be human.
When someone points that out, when they refuse to be disposable, they become difficult. Sometimes being difficult saves more than one career. Sometimes it saves a few people. If you want more stories like this, long, messy, and human, follow the channel. And if you're wondering whether I'd do it all the same way again, the honest answer remains unsettled. I don't know. I only know I tried to make the cost smaller for those who never asked to be in the middle of it. That, in the end, is the only consolation I can live with.